Hey guys, it's Miss Polanco. Here's your agenda. Take a quick moment. Go ahead and look at that. First, you're going to do your mini lecture, and then you're going to go into Google Documents to do your short response. Before we even start our lesson, I just a quick check-in. How are you guys feeling? And how do you feel about remote learning? Go ahead, take a moment and answer that question. I hope everyone is feeling great. I miss you guys. All right, so our current unit. We're in Unit 7, Decolonization and Nationalism. And the question that we're going to be thinking about this entire unit is how have colonized people around the world resisted imperialism? I even added it in Spanish right under just in case. Um, but the question is how have colonized people around the world resisted imperialism? So we started talking about India. So let's quickly review this and let's see what you guys remember about last week. So how did India resist imperialism? What did they do? What did you guys remember from last week? Go ahead, take a moment and answer the question that's going to pop up right now. So, if you answered that India tried to get away from Great Britain and try to gain their independence, then you're right. So, just to quickly review this, if you guys remember, India was colonized by Great Britain, and there was two major religious groups. You had the Hindu, which was 75% of the population, and the Muslim population, which was about 25%. Both of these groups wanted independence from who? Yeah, Great Britain. All right, so Great Britain partitioned, so that means to split up. So they split up the country in 1947. And if you guys remember from the video from last week, what were some of the challenges from partition? If you guessed correctly, or if you remember correctly, some of the challenges were that families were displaced, and a lot of people actually lost their lives because of this. There was a lot of violent outbreaks because of the partition in India. So in 1947, they split up, and you had in India for Hindus, and you had Pakistan for Muslims. So today, we're actually going to start talking about the Chinese Civil War, and kind of we're going to be focusing on, did China gain their independence? So go ahead and set up your notebooks. All right, let's go over some vocab words. Decolonization. What do you think that word means? Right, so decolonization is when a former colony becomes independent. So if you're still not sure what that word is, please make sure to write this down in your vocab. Decolonization is when a former colony becomes independent. Nationalism. We've heard this word quite a few times in the past. What do you think nationalism means? If you're not sure, take a look at the picture to the right. What do you see happening? What do you think it might be connected to? So nationalism is having extreme pride in one's country. And it usually ends up with extreme measures, um, most of the time a war. And people kind of use this usually in a negative way for the most part. And today we're actually going to see how China used nationalism to try and gain their independence, and if they were successful. Again, if you're not sure what nationalism is, please go ahead and write this in your notebook, preferably in your vocab section. So we need to kind of go over some information that we talked about in the beginning of the year, not even a few months ago. The Opium War of 1839. What do you guys remember about the Opium War? So, if you remembered correctly, this is when Great Britain wanted to trade with China, but China really wasn't about it. They didn't want anything to do with any of the British goods. So, what the British end up doing is they start to think about a plan, some way to get into China. So, they find a product that the Chinese would want to buy. And that product happens to be a very addictive drug called opium. So if you actually look to the right, You have a political cartoon here. You have this British man kind of feeding this Chinese man opium. And the reason they did this is because they knew that if they got the people in China hooked to this drug, that they would need the British to come to supply them with it. The Chinese government was not okay with this. They were very upset and they were angry, which ends up leading to a war, which sadly enough, China actually lost this war and then they were forced to open up to trade in Europe. Our keyword here is imperialism. What do you guys remember about this word? What does imperialism mean? So, the Qing dynasty was ruled by the European powers and they established a sphere of influence. And what this means is that the areas in which European nations controlled all business and trade. So China no longer had as much say as they used to have before when it came to talking about trade and who they got to trade with and who they were doing business with. And remember, China didn't want this to happen, so they're still very upset. So much so that this time period was actually called the Century of Humiliation. Why do you think this was called the Century of Humiliation? So, China's not happy. They're not feeling it. They're upset. They got the Europeans all up in their country. Great Britain is making money. China's like, hey, what's going on? Remember, they called it the period of humiliation. So what ends up happening in 1927 through 1942 is that China ends up erupting into a civil war. What's a civil war? Would you guys remember what that word means? Right, so civil war is when citizens of the same country fight each other for control. So if we look at the map to the right, we have a part of the map, this is China, that is red, and a part of it that is blue. So that means that these two sides were actually fighting against each other. But to be more specific, you had the nationalists versus the communists. So with both of these two groups, you have two main leaders. And excuse me, they both have had different goals. Jiang Zeshi, his goals was democracy and using nationalism. He wanted to create kind of like a stable economy, so economy security. The people who supported him were the people with money, so the bankers, the business people, and the upper class. To the right, you have the communists, and the leader was Mao Zedong. So the goals was a communist economy. Really quickly, what is communism again? And it's no surprise the supporters that he had. So he had the rural farmers and the peasants. The reasons that this it's important to note who the supporters were is because it's based on money, right? So if we're thinking about democracy, we're thinking more a little bit more about the capitalist system that they were trying to put in place. When we're thinking about communism, we're thinking more about how they shared everything in a sense, right? So the businesses were not owned privately, the companies weren't owned privately, and everyone was on an equal playing ground or playing field, all right? So that's why when you look at Mao Zedong and we're talking about that one of his goals was a communist economy, the people who are supporting him were actually the rural farmers and not the business owners or the bankers because they were actually going to lose money if Mao Zedong came into power. Who do you think actually comes into power? Well, if you guessed Mao Zedong, then you're correct. Because what ends up happening, and we still see this today, is that China becomes communist. So in 1949, communism actually wins. Mao Zedong is the winner. And something really interesting, if you guys actually look to the right of the slide right here, who are these men in the picture? Do they remind you of any other communist leaders? So, because there was a civil war before China became communist, the nationalists who were fighting against them actually end up fleeing the island and going to Taiwan because now their lives are at risk And they also really strongly disagree with what moving forward, what was going to happen in China. So the key point is that Mao used nationalism as a tool to unite a large and in a diverse country. So he used people's extreme sense of pride to bring them together because he knew that the people in China did not want outside factors in their country. So they didn't want the British in their country. They didn't want these other European countries trading in their country. So he was able to use that to bring them all together. So now that you finished watching that, you guys are actually going to go ahead and go onto Google Classroom and you're going to be answering these questions. So I'm going to quickly read the directions for you. Based on what you learned in today's lesson, answer the questions below. Your response for each question should contain 3 to 4 sentences. So you need to make sure you have capital letters and punctuation, guys. And support your answer with facts from the mini lecture, okay? So how did nationalism change China? And the second question is, in your opinion, is nationalism, so having extreme pride in your country, a good thing or a bad thing? If you guys have any question, please make sure to go to the parking lot and ask them, or you can send me an email. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow. Well, I don't get to see you, but I'll talk to you soon, hopefully.